Hello and welcome back. In this episode of Your Edge, we're giving a basic course in the technique of engraving. Now, this video is a part that's left over from a larger project, but we decided to dedicate the technique its own episode. Every good project starts out with a sketch. I usually use a notepad, large scale, similar to the one you can buy at any art store. And then I meticulously draw out the design. I throw away a lot of the sketches, some parts I keep. I keep the pentimentos, and occasionally I reference previous sketches in future projects. Every single drawing I do starts out large. First of all, it's way easier working on this scale rather than this scale in designing your motif. And you get to think about what you're actually going to be doing in the physical metal with greater ease. After the draft is complete, I use tracing paper and break up the drawing into quadrants. And then I use the scaling device, that is, one square like this is equal to a square like this in the actual engraving, and I transfer the drawing onto the material itself. Now, I use several techniques for that. Sometimes I take the tracing paper itself and just use tiny pinholes to scar the future surface, and then I go with the engraver and follow them. Or sometimes you can dip a little bit of white paint or whiteout onto the metal and then draw right over it using the quadrant transfer technique. The reason why you use paint or especially whiteout is because they both dull out the shiny bits, which rest your eyes, and you can directly draw on them using pen or pencil. After the design has been transferred, what I begin with is a V-shaped bottom engraver. Remember, most of my tools I make myself, and none of them are standard. And I generally follow the Japanese style engraving school as opposed to the Western one. However, all the skills I'm showing here are transferable between them, and each one of you can pick the one you prefer. I use the V-bottom chisel to outline my sketch. I re-sketch the drawing, but deeper. This allows me to guide my cuts later around areas that either shouldn't be touched or will allow me to refine the cuts. Think of your initial cuts with a V-bottom chisel as if they are a train track for subsequent engravers. After I outline with my V-bottom chisel all the contours, I take a flat bottom chisel and slowly start decking all of my surfaces. Decking with a flat bottom allows me to create levels in my work before I even begin to do anything figurative. You don't need to be perfect at this stage because as you're refining your design, you begin correcting your unevenness. However, there's no need to be intentionally sloppy or careless. There's often a desire at this stage to start introducing details that you like. You could be very well inspired that day, or a piece of music hits your headphones and you just go at it. Don't do that. One of the reasons is this is too early, and you will be very reluctant at removing those unnecessary details later. If you do that, it's likely you've already miscalculated your levels at the decking stage. And quite frankly, it will set you up for failure down the line where you will have to redo gigantic portions of your engraving. This happens to me quite often because I love textures, and I often start introducing feather textures when something already looks kind of like a wing, and then I have to recut the whole thing. Not running ahead of the train should be a mantra as you begin dabbling in this work. We apply details like eyelids, hair, cloth, roping design last, and treat them as if they were texture skins in a computer game. And that's actually a very helpful way of thinking about it. When most of your form is done, it will look kind of bland, kind of like a lollipop that's being close to used up. And at that stage, you go in with smaller chisels and start introducing finer and finer details until the image comes alive. You reduce the size of the cut, and as the size is being reduced, the type of detail that you introduce becomes more and more refined. Summer is coming. I'm traveling. I'm teaching classes. I'm teaching engraving classes. You're traveling, coming to me to take my engraving classes. Means both me and you will be outside of your normal healthcare provider. And that's why this episode is brought to you by ZocDoc. Whether you're broken down on the side of the road in an unfamiliar place Wherever you are, ZocDoc lets you search and compare in-network doctors.
They have more than 150,000 providers within 200 plus specialties all across all 50 states.
ZocDoc has tons of reviews from actual patients, and you can pick and choose the doctor that suits you. The best part about it, ZocDoc is completely free to use.
Taking care of your health just got a whole lot easier. Head to ZocDoc.com, that's hard to say, /thatworks to get started, and check that one off your appointment to-do list.
Now, here is a very good tip. The reason why your chisels break is because they're too dull. And as the chisel becomes dull, more and more of the impact stress goes into the chisel directly rather than into the material. So it doesn't hurt after every 3 or 4 cuts, resharpening your chisel on a very fine diamond plate, and that is what I use. My eyes are not the best eyes on the planet. I know that because I wear glasses. And that problem is exacerbated when every new cut is a mirror. That's not so bad until you're very deep into your project and the entire surface you're working on looks like one of those disco balls that disorients you and you lose your depth perception. To mitigate this, I use one of the 2 techniques or the combination of them. One thing you can do is take a basic Sharpie and rub it all over your surface that you're working on, dulling down that effect, and your depth perception is immediately brought back. You can also see a little bit of flaws better that way. The other thing that I do is I use basic ferric chloride or vinegar to slightly gently etch the surface I'm working on. It dulls down the reflection and brings about depth once again. Just don't forget to wash it down with a little bit of baking soda to prevent rust. And depth in engraving is key, especially deep relief. Sharpie is nice because it also allows me to use the scribe and introduce future details into the piece. Either one of the techniques allows you to engrave for much longer without fatigue. Your eyes will stay fresher and you will make less mistakes. One of the major differences between Eastern engraving and Western engraving is the use of a scraper. Now, the scraper is basically a tool that looks like a scalpel and a lathe cutter had a baby. What you basically do is use your thumb as a pivot point and with your other hand slowly scrape the surfaces of your design. The scraping allows you to round over any surfaces without needing to go with a chisel again and again. A scraper also allows you to deck your inlay in cases like gold or silver, and it doesn't introduce as bright of a cut. And overall, it's a very nice tool to use before you introduce your final details. Now it's time to talk a little bit more about the chisels. Each type of chisel comes in various sizes, and sometimes the smaller sizes are about the dimensions of the tip of a sewing needle. If you decide to work with something smaller than that, you will descend into madness. Now, even the flat bottom chisel has multiple purposes. The super wide one is very good at creating even flat backgrounds. That is either used for inlay or as artistic expression in its own right. And the smallest one I use to prep my recesses for inlay. Now, in reality, all of them are used interchangeably. However, when you make a set of chisels, make multiples of the same type because you never know which ones you'll need at any given time. Now, an underappreciated type of chisel is the round bottom chisel. The main difference between the types of round bottom chisels is the radius. This type of chisel is very good for multiple purposes. For example, the wide bottom one is amazing for creating textures of fabrics. The smallest one I use to create details around the face, nose, eyelids, and so on. And the medium one is absolutely great at creating flower petals. Most of the chisels that I use are highly derivative of woodworking chisels. You probably already noticed that from the shape. In fact, if you don't feel ready to work with metal, or you don't like metal shards in your socks, and quite frankly want to practice on something easier, I recommend picking up some wood chisels, some wood, and treating it as a larger scale engraving project. That way you gain some experience. Now, don't let yourself be intimidated by the complexity of the project that you see in the screen. Every big project is either starting out as a small project and grows, or can be conceptually broken down in a series of much smaller and simpler steps. Even I get intimidated by big projects, and I might sit around for days before I gain the courage to even make the first cut. And after you make the first cut, there comes the second and the third, and lo and behold, you're deep into it. You don't have to start out with deep relief. In fact, I don't recommend it. What I do recommend is starting with single cut scroll work. And before you start practicing scroll work, I highly insist on you picking up drawing, because ultimately, all engraving, all sculpture is a matter of mind, eye, and hand coordination. Nothing trains your mind to hand coordination better than drawing, especially drawing from life. A good artist always has a portfolio of their favorite tricks and shapes. It could be flowers, it could be feathers, the favorite textures, or whatever you want. And whenever you feel like a little bit in a stupor, you go back to your sketches, and that's where you have that aha moment. This flower will be perfect here. Or you can remember, this is how I put the curl at the end of the scroll. And it will always help you to keep sketching and always improving. Now, let's go back to cutting. One of the things that will make you stumble is if your material is inconsistent, it is either too hard or too soft. One example is, imagine you're starting working on a piece of silver or copper. They're fully annealed, so the first cut that you make, you cut too deep. The curl that you make, instead of flying off, keeps dragging and mudding like chewing gum, and your cutter gets completely stuck because it's now cutting through basically plasticine. Or you don't start with a fully annealed piece of copper or silver, but rather prepare it by slightly work hardening it, making the cuts much easier and cleaner. Copper and silver are actually the best examples of this, and it's better to work harden them before you start the cuts. And if you want to, you can anneal them at a later stage. The best two materials to start engraving with are work-hardened aluminum or brass. They cut clean, they cut beautifully, and you will enjoy yourself. Now, let's imagine another case. You're well into your project and you pick up the next part. Let's say a pommel or a guard. You forged on it before for a bit, it was sitting in the back of the shop, you forgot about it, you're cleaning it up on the sander, now it's all perfectly set up for you to carve. You make your first cut, your chisel bounces off, tip breaks, nothing bites in. Well, this is the case where your material has not been annealed. It could have been because of the forging, improper heat cycling. You could have accidentally quenched it so that you can hold it, but now parts of it are hard. In this case, you do have to anneal your project. It's better to anneal before you try to make the first cuts, just prevents the scale and all kinds of other stuff. And keep in mind, if it is materials like iron or steel, they never really get too soft for cutting. So the softer you make them, the better it is for you. Other materials don't quite work that way. For example, I caution you against engraving over mosaic Damascus. Part of it has to do with the nature of Damascus and how it comes about. In a material that is monosteel, let's say 1045 in its fully annealed state, for all your practical purposes, the directions of the cuts don't matter, as the material is fairly uniform for your practical purposes. With random pattern Damascus, You still have 2 or more different types of steels forge welded together. However, because they're different alloys, at the grain boundaries between one alloy and the other one, you do have curbitic structures being formed. That's the nature of the beast. When it's random pattern Damascus, those layers are virtually in the direction that you're cutting, so it's fairly easy. However, with mosaic Damascus, your layers are perpendicular to the directions of your cut always. So you're cutting smoothly, and then your chisel hits the curbitic layer, bounces a bit, and continues carving. And that produces a lot of stress on your chisel. The best way to imagine that, as mentioned earlier in the videos, wood. When you use a wood chisel along the grain, it cuts beautifully. When you use a chisel slightly cross-grain to the side, it cuts, but you know, your chips are not good and you're not that clean. However, it is very annoying to cut at the end of the stump. So, because all the layers are not quite consistent with each other. And it doesn't matter how much you anneal your mosaic Damascus piece, it still produces this effect. And that's why high relief, high figurative engravings on mosaic Damascus are either dulled down, they're not well executed, and the details don't quite fall the way you want them to. Now, you don't need to cut on top of mosaic Damascus. One of the reasons is when you etch it, the etching itself kills your detail. However, think about it. The whole point of having Damascus is to create a beautiful texture. You don't need to have engraving there. And the whole point of engraving is to create a figurative or textured design that is not Damascus. So what do? We do what I prefer to do. I take a piece of medium carbon steel, 1045, and I forge weld it in the early stages of the project before I even begin engraving it in the location where my panels will be and in the shape of my intended panels. Because I know 1045 very well, I know all the procedures for properly annealing it. And before I begin engraving, I slightly etch the piece so that I know the borders of my panel versus the mosaic Damascus that I have to the side. The advantage of using monosteel for this is that when you etch the sword, your etching does not kill the details, but in fact can enhance them by introducing a slightly worn eggshell look that tones down the contrasts where the contrasts are not necessary. Now, quite a few of you have asked what I make my chisels out of. And yes, I do make them all myself and all my hammers. I prefer W1 steel. And I prefer it for specific reasons, although other steels will actually be better. The reason I prefer W1, it is because it is easy water quenchable steel. I forge out the rough blank, I grind it, I can heat it up and quench it at a campsite. I could be traveling, throw it in the fire, watch for the color, quench it in water, clean it up, and then watch the color draw back as you're tempering it. Other steels don't behave that way, and that's why I generally don't prefer them. With this type of engraving, I caution you against using carbide for your chisels. And I know in modern pneumatic engraving, carbide engravers exist. However, the nature of the process is different, and steel chisels, even high-speed steel chisels, are better. With pneumatic engraving, you don't have a hammer beating on your chisel. You have a gentle pulse that is very regular doing the carving. Here, you're using your hands and eyes and minimal machinery. So I recommend you to move towards simpler steel chisels. So let's say I'm traveling to you to teach a class. I will be traveling with a bunch of chisel blanks that all I have to do is clamp them in the vise, use a file to shape them. We can find any fire to heat treat them, and you're ready to go. You see the collar dragging? Now let's imagine you got yourself a bunch of W1 blanks, you got a nice hammer. What do you need to do to make your cutters? Well, I would start out with a V-bottom chisel. It is ubiquitous, and you begin exploring with it anyway. You're seeing it on the screen right now, but I cannot tell you exactly at what angles I am shaping them. The reason is I've been doing it by eye and hand for so long that I never even got around to measuring anything. I suspect it's between 30 and 40 degrees, but if I'm mistaken, don't yell at me, don't be mad. And you're beginning anyway, this is the time to experiment and you will find the perfect angle for you. The other thing is, this is a very archaic version of figurative engraving, so a lot of ancient, medieval, and indigenous shapes are not very well measured or preserved. However, I'm sure you can find resources online that will provide you with the exact measurements you want. Whatever the angle is, don't forget to add a tiny lip, a step at the bottom of your chisel. If you don't do it, your chisel will drive itself into your material, it will chip, or it won't even come out. That step is what your graver glides on as soon as it starts cutting your project. And it's kind of like a pair of skates. And without that lip, you will have a problem. It's about 0.5 millimeter, maybe less, but it's a critical part of the carving process. One thing I forgot to mention is the physics of engraving and what's happening, especially if you're working on high carbon steel. I recommend hand sanding your piece before you even begin engraving it, before you even begin tracing. Even if you went through all the grits on your grinder, you still should hand sand before engraving. The reason is physics. Your abrasives on the machine are moving very, very fast. That means as on a microscopic level, it's contacting the steel, the first micron or submicron heats up to critical temperature and gets smudged. You don't see the color, but the microscopic layer right on top is basically heat treated. And that's the phenomena you might encounter if you take the same anneal billets. One you just grind at 220 for a while and set aside, and the other one you hand sand and set aside. And over a series of like 100 of those billets, the ones that were machine ground will wear out your chisels much faster than the ones that are hand sanded. You don't see this phenomena with your eyes, but it is there. And if you take a precise laser and point it at the surface that you're grinding as you're grinding it, microscopic bits of it will spike at critical temperature or above. The process is so fast that the material doesn't even get to develop scale or color yet, but it is there. Think about it the following way. The spark that comes off when you grind it is burning in the air because it's heated up by the impact with small pieces of grit on your abrasive. Well, the material that it came from is also being heated up at a microscopic level, and the mass of your piece immediately quenches it. Well, I think that's all for today. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you're starting engraving, even if you're not starting engraving, it should help you understand how certain artifacts and modern objects are being made. And it will give you a deeper appreciation of what the artist had to go through to bring about the shapes that you enjoy. Now, if you like this, you can now go back to our previous videos and appreciate them in a different light. Also, check out our latest cool projects that we do either for fun or as a custom order. And stay tuned, we have part 2 where we go more in depth into the engraving and show you more tools and techniques. And as always, keep honing your edge.